Yeah, my name's Kenny Anderson and I'm the director of the Scottish Wider Access Programme. We're a partnership with colleges and universities, and we work to ensure that adults who are returning back to education, particularly those with no or very few qualifications, have an opportunity to spend a year with us at college on an access programme, and thereafter to either progress to university on a degree or to their college on an HNC. So our main job at SWAP is obviously to encourage adults to return back to education and then ensure they've got the proper programmes to ensure they have their progression after that. So that's our kind of main task. How about yourself, Aaron? What is it you do?
So I work for an organisation called the National Society of Apprentices. So we are the representative body of lots of apprentices right across the UK. So we work with apprentices in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And my job is to do a variety of things, but mainly to support our leadership team of elected apprentice representatives, so as apprentices across the UK, but also kind of support them on policy, on campaigns, on trying to improve apprenticeships in a way that apprentices would like. So that's kind of where I am.
Yeah. How's things been changing with COVID-19?
So lots. So I suppose the real interesting thing about, from a policy perspective, about apprenticeships is that they are both workers and learners. And so if you compare and contrast it to the kind of stuff that's happening to mainstream students in colleges and universities, it's an added component because they are still being affected in terms of their education part being disrupted, but they are also workers, and so they are facing disruption, like all of us, on their work side as well. So a lot of apprentices have been furloughed, and the advice from government has been fairly interesting on that, and fairly imprecise, I think is probably a polite way of saying it. So if you are an apprentice and have been furloughed, there is an expectation that your off-the-job learning bit, so your education bit of your apprenticeship, still goes ahead. When that's kind of in a college or a university, that's kind of happening at the moment, and that seems to be kind of working in the same way that college students and the university students are still accessing some of their education. But for the majority of apprentices who's trained through independent training providers, it's a more interesting kind of situation, because there's kind of wide-ranging thing going on about what we call the 20% off-the-job learning, which is the 1 day a week that you work. So you don't go to your work, you do your education bit. But there's quite a lot of apprentices who there's different methods of that kind of 20% happening. Some do what's called day release. So they go 1 day a week, they go to a college or they go to their training provider and they do some education in a kind of traditional classroom setting. Some have block release, and so they do kind of a couple of weeks or a couple of months doing the education bit, and then they go to work. And then there's quite a lot of people who also who do what's called an assessed visitor model, which is where that they are at work 5 days a week, but there is planned work, kind of education work that goes into that, and they have an assessor who kind of visits them once every 6 weeks or so, who kind of sets the work and stuff. And that bit is the bit where there's a real problem, because it's really hard to replicate that online. But also a lot of these organisations have been saying that they've been doing it brilliantly for years, and now it's becoming clear that they are not necessarily doing that.
Yeah, it's the kind of levels of complexity that you're having to deal with in terms of finding solutions for people, that the kind of added layer to the work just now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And like our normal kind of policy work involves us doing lots of stuff on kind of pay, on the work conditions, on the quality of their education, on mental health, on lots and lots of different things. But it's kind of this current situation and the thing that's going on with COVID has basically kind of shrunk everything down, and we're now having to really concentrate on like one specific policy area. What about you?
Yeah, our main challenges of our colleges in Scotland are continuing their learning for students. So they kind of moved within probably around about a 3 or 4 day phase to take their learning, which had been classroom based, to online learning, which was just a kind of massive challenge for them to do that, and then for students to adapt to that kind of situation as well was a considerable challenge. For us, there's a kind of academic level, because we would normally be working our students right up until June to make sure that they've got the academic ability then to progress on to university, and we're mulling issues over in terms of how we do that, how our university partners will potentially help us during the summertime with added activities. And then there is the personal element, which has always been there with SWAP, and particularly adult students. So about a third of our students are key workers, and they would often be a key worker to support their studies because they were working in health and social care. But now they're key worker, and obviously becomes a bit of a priority, not just for themselves, but for the country as well. And about 40% of our students have got children. So as soon as the schools kind of closed physically down, then all of a sudden their ability to study has been affected quite substantially as well. So we're working through the sort of academic basis, but we're also thinking very carefully about how we can deal with people's individual circumstances around these particular caring responsibilities, and key worker ones being the main one. So we're looking at extending our help and resources really right up until students would start university in September. And again, just trying to find out if we can find very personal solutions for people, such as is there ways that colleges can get laptops to people at home, because people have been accessing the internet through their phones. But of course, you kind of need a laptop in order to ensure that you can do that kind of academic study that they would normally receive within a classroom. And I think that sort of holistic view is probably, we were talking to NUS about some of the issues, particularly in around well-being and mental health. We've been conscious of that for a good while in respect of the students who we're working and dealing with. But I think that's become particularly pertinent during the kind of reaction to COVID-19. And I take it you've seen that as well in respect to your work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really shone a light on some of the areas that are not brilliant. So I think you've hit the nail on the head in a lot of ways there, which is that the thing we've kind of concentrated on in the education sector is the education bit, and you've articulated the turnaround in 3 days really well, and like that's an extraordinary human achievement to have kind of moved education, the kind of infrastructure of education, from a physical classroom base and to online in that such a short amount of time, and to do it in a way that is kind of working is pretty impressive. I think the thing that we may have taken our eye off a little bit is exactly what you said afterwards around the kind of pastoral support that we offer students and apprentices. And I think the thing for us is that we have known for a long time that apprentices do not get the kind of pastoral support that most other people in education would expect to get. And the thing that's kind of going on at the moment, the COVID stuff, has really shone a light on that. And there are, it's really bad. Like, yeah. It's not. I can't really shine a good light on it. It's not good.
I mean, we're probably quite fortunate in that we have, college-based, and a lot of the colleges are pretty well developed in terms of what they were doing for students anyway, in terms of well-being and mental health. It's just that difficulty of doing it on a distance online basis rather than face-to-face, which is probably the most helpful way to help people with illness. Are you finding that, the colleges that you're working with are still able to provide a little bit of support for some of your apprentices?
Yeah, and so actually one of the things that has been really interesting to see has been colleagues who work in student unions in colleges who have completely changed their model and moved completely online and to a distance model, have really picked up the baton and and colleges and student unions are really doing some excellent stuff around supporting students and supporting those in need from a distant space, from afar.
It's kind of we always one of the things that we put in place was a kind of weekly top tips from a former student that we had. John, we're very fortunate with John. He's a guy who's kept in touch with us, and he is now a mental health nurse, but he was a former SWAT student, armed forces, and he kind of volunteered to put together a top tips, which is far more effective than me trying to do that for students, because he's kind of had that lived experience of a lot of the issues, and it's far more practically based. I always find it's quite difficult to find what works for you in terms of wellness, because it's it can be very individual. So just having that ability of someone who has been through it saying to you, this is worthwhile trying, certainly from our perspective has worked quite well as a way of kind of trying to get those messages in.
Absolutely, and our main kind of source of information about this whole thing is the apprentices we have relationships with on the ground, and talking to them about the experience they're having through their different kind of models. And there's really I suppose the spotlight I was talking about has really shone a light on some really great provision, and then really some glaring gaps in other bits of provision. And it really kind of depends on what kind of apprenticeship you're on, where you live, and what kind of education provider you have, because some of them are just not set up to do this, and the funding doesn't exist to provide that kind of stuff as well.
I mean, thinking ahead, which we are going to have to start to do at some point, even though it feels almost quite daunting. The thoughts that this was going to be a kind of 3-week thing and then we would head back to normal is obviously no longer going to be the case. How are you looking at kind of modifying some of your work as we think about adapting to COVID-19?
Well, it's from a national society perspective, it's really interesting because So I'm a home worker. My colleague Ben is works in Edinburgh in the NUS Scotland office.
Yeah,
but we spend a couple of days a week, usually on the road, kind of out and about, speaking to apprentices face to face. Like, that's our model, and we're able to speak to over 1,000 apprentices a year because I spend so much time kind of travelling and going to the places where apprentices are. So that has been the biggest challenge really of this, is to envision a world where we're unable to do that, and try and find a way of doing the quite complex, from our perspective at least, thing that we do with apprentices, and moving that onto online. Because both Ben and I are experienced facilitators, and if you can put us in a room with some apprentices, we know that we can facilitate a space where we get the thing we need, and it's also enjoyable, and that the apprentices find it interesting and engaging. It is more difficult to do that like this, for example, and so we have been exploring over the last couple of weeks around how to do that, and my colleague Ben has been doing loads of work around moving our work online. So was able to kind of put in place basically our national conference, our kind of policy setting thing, was meant to be at the beginning of April or end of March, and obviously that couldn't happen as a physical event. So in a week or so, he was able to turn a really complex consensus decision making stolen from the Quakers kind of policy making process, and turn it into an online process, which got the same result. I think the interesting thing is how we improve it, so it's not just about us getting the thing that we need out of it, but it's also engaging, interesting, and keeps apprentices involved and brought into the thing that they're doing.
I think one of our challenges is that obviously I'd say that we'd moved things online into distance learning very, very quickly. I think that has sometimes also shown some of the difficulties in that learning being online and distance, and I think a lot of students are missing that physical contact that they have of being able to go to a college setting. And I suppose we are just starting to get our head around what that might mean in terms of our colleges starting again in August time. And I suppose from my point of view, what I want to make sure, because we obviously work with a lot of students with disadvantage, who are living in poverty, is that when we do try and put together these new measures, that we maybe think about them first, rather than have them as a kind of afterthought in terms of some of the difficulties that they're dealing with. I think that's going to be particularly pertinent for issues in and around well-being and mental health, because you can see how easily those issues could be forgotten about in terms of a policy area in respect to people just scrambling to get people back together again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really heartening hearing you talking about a student-centered kind of decision-making process, and they design a user-friendly design kind of this stuff, because that's, I think you're right, often forgotten and often causes problems. Because I think also, like, the students who are on your courses, the peer learning and the social aspect of those courses, and the kind of psychological impact of bonding with other humans is really important, and one of the things that really makes these things like you're doing really valuable. And in a education, like a physical education space where social distancing is still a thing, that becomes a really pertinent question, and one that we need to find an answer to.
And I think that's also quite important for your apprenticeship guys as well, and women, of course, in terms of you know, that kind of work experience, having that opportunity work experience is so important for the development, and how you begin to replicate that. I think it's kind of going to be considerably challenging. So
absolutely, and like there are also
Karen,
yeah. I mean, there are challenges as well, because there's an apprenticeship for everything. So there are, like, if you are an office-based apprentice, actually the work thing is probably quite easy to solve. You just put desks further apart, and people come in, people do more homeworking, but when they're in the office, they are kind of a bit socially distanced. If you're a hairdresser, or you're a nail technician, or you're an engineer, like, those things are quite, you need to be interacting with humans in a non-social distancing way. So the answers to apprenticeships, or how to kind of keep apprenticeships going, is wide and varied depending on the apprenticeship that the person is doing.
Absolutely. I could do some of your barber apprenticeships coming around here at some point. Aaron, they're going to be pretty busy in the
Luckily,
future.
I don't really have that problem, so that's okay. That's all right. I think we're in a really interesting bit in history here, right, where we're in lockdown and we don't really know what coming out of lockdown looks like, and that the way that our government has, the UK government has kind of led on this, has been very much we hold the information and we'll give it to you when you need it, which has been, like, looking at other countries, has been slightly different, and like France and Germany and New Zealand and lots of other places are being a lot more upfront about the way they're doing. And I think that one of the knock-on effects for that is that, because we don't really know what it's going to look like, the planning bit that we would normally be doing in jobs like ours is more difficult to do, because we have to make presumptions, and those presumptions can be wrong. So I think the honest answer is we don't know.
I take it, I mean, we've got some students where things have just been so tough, we've kind of said to them, look, we'll just keep our promises, but we'll keep them for next year. So, you know, you'll be able to return next year and look at that study. But as that study next year looks as if it's also going to be quite challenging and different, you start to think, well, maybe we're going to have to do something for the following year as well. So it's almost like we are in that position of starting to have to think about a kind of 3-year academic cycle in terms of how we work our way through this, and potentially then have to go back into lockdown again, depending on what happens. We were probably quite fortunate in that most of our students were around about 3/4 of the way through their programme, so there has always been a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel for them. Students starting in these situations is going to be very difficult, and we're going to have to rethink our model in terms of numbers of students in classrooms, and what that means in terms of potential for them, as well as clearly the amount of people who are going to have to retrain and rethink about their career opportunities as a result of what has happened. And I've absolutely no doubt that will have a massive bearing on the work that we do across the 4 nations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we seem to have a habit of concentrating on the really big decisions. I've had lots of people talk about, well, we should change the start of the school year to January, and then we can hopefully by then we'll be kind of fairly back to normal and we can just kind of start doing that. I think the really interesting thing is the real micro decisions that, like you're talking about, that we need to make in a classroom about how we organise our classrooms and how we organise the way that we deliver education. Like those answers are much more interesting to me, because I think actually that's where the change comes, and like that's where the kind of real positive stuff can happen.
Yeah, and there'll be lots of good examples within your apprenticeship schemes as well, then, of people coming up with fantastic solutions that we just can't think about ourselves, but they'll manage to work through.
And absolutely, and like part of the thing that we're doing as well, and hopefully we can do, is be the kind of communicator around, because one thing that we're really bad at in the education sector is doing something really well and then telling everyone else about it, because we're not in competition. We can share and we can do good stuff. So hopefully one of the things that we're able to do at the National Society is to kind of highlight some really good stuff and teach other people how to kind of disseminate that around, so other people can start improving as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean we are kind of. I mean, everybody's in the same situation just now in terms of that. So that is the one good thing, is that because this has got consequences for all of us, that I think there's an awful lot we can learn from that. And I think good on the NUS for keeping these discussions going.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.